Early humans, fear, dark caves, monsters all around. A classic myth. Now let's look at reality. Here are six extinct animals that humans weren't afraid of. They ate them. And some of these monsters became the basis of life for entire tribes. Let's start with the first and largest. The mammoth was not just food, it was an entire survival system wrapped in fur. One successful hunt provided meat for several weeks, skins for shelter and clothing, and bones for making tools. One mammoth meant not just survival but prosperity, even in the harshest of times. The problem was that hunting a mammoth was no easy task. It was impossible to defeat a mammoth in a fair fight. The real strategy was endurance. We followed them for hours, sometimes even days. When they stopped to rest, we still stayed close. No matter how far they ran, every time they returned, we were waiting for them. Eventually, their bodies simply could not move anymore. When they fell from exhaustion, we approached and finished them off. This method is called exhaustion hunting. And believe it or not, it wasn't the only technique we used against mammoths. In places like Mexico, people dug shallow pits for the mammoths to fall into. Others used spears or arrows. Some groups even managed to push them off cliffs. And technically speaking, mammoth is still on the menu today. Kind of. One guy actually dug some out of the permafrost and tried it. He said it tasted like freezer-burned beef jerky, which honestly still sounds better than another option people went for. Because, yeah, baby mammoth brains were also a thing. We found young skulls with cracks that suggest Neanderthals were breaking them open to get to the brain. And the worst part is they probably ate it raw. It's also pretty likely that we ate Neanderthals themselves. Not because anyone wanted to, at least I hope not, but more likely because people were starving. In one cave, researchers discovered Neanderthal bones with the same cut marks we leave when butchering animals. We don't know exactly what happened, or even for sure who did it. Now, not every extinct animal would have fought back like that. Take the dodo, for example. A few million years ago, some pigeons flew across the Indian Ocean and landed on the island of Mauritius, a place with literally zero natural predators. Over time, those pigeons got big. Really big. Around 3 feet tall, they ended up becoming one of the largest animals on the island. With nothing trying to eat them, they slowly lost their sense of fear. They just didn't need it anymore. And that might actually explain how they got their name. Sailors called them dodo, which roughly means fool. Or the name could have come from their call, which supposedly sounded pretty ridiculous. Either way, catching them was incredibly easy. That's basically the only reason anyone bothered eating them, because they sure weren't tasty. Historical accounts describe dodo meat as tough, greasy, and bitter. They were so unpleasant that early visitors often ignored the birds completely and hunted giant tortoises instead. And despite what most people think, humans alone didn't wipe the dodo out. Honestly, the species was probably doomed from the beginning. Hear me out. They couldn't fly, and each year they laid just one large egg directly on the ground. Basically, they were serving their future on a silver platter. Once humans arrived with animals like pigs, rats, and pet monkeys, it was over. Those eggs were way too easy to find. And with no backup plan, a single bad breeding season could erase an entire generation. That's why, just 60 years after being discovered, a species that once numbered in the thousands completely vanished. Now, if we head west of Mauritius, we find a story that's similar but cranked up to an extreme. This is Madagascar, a massive island that's been isolated since before the dinosaurs even went extinct. That long separation produced some truly bizarre giants. One of them was a massive eagle so terrifying that even today, some lemurs still have warning calls for it, despite the bird being gone for centuries. But the real nightmare was even bigger. In fact, it was the heaviest bird to ever exist, and one of the tallest too. This was the elephant bird, the undisputed giant of Madagascar. Strangely enough, its closest living relative is the kiwi, which lives more than 6,500 miles away. But unlike that tiny bird, a single kick from this thing would almost definitely kill you. So how did early humans survive around it? For most of the 9,000 years we coexisted, we weren't actually hunting the bird itself. Instead, we were after its eggs, massive eggs, bigger than any laid by any vertebrate, living or extinct. That includes absolute monsters like the sauropod dinosaurs. Those massive eggs ended up being an incredible food source. Archaeologists have found huge amounts of eggshell fragments sitting right next to ancient human fire pits, which means we were cooking up, quite literally, the largest omelets ever made. Their downfall came from us taking too many eggs and destroying their habitat. But they weren't the only massive creature our ancestors helped eat into extinction. Meet the Steller's sea cow, the largest sirenian to ever exist. Sirenians are the group that includes manatees and dugongs. The biggest living ones today grow to around 13 feet long and weigh about 3,500 pounds. The Steller's sea cow, though, could reach 30 feet in length and weigh up to 20,000 pounds. That's like comparing an average person to someone 12 feet tall who weighs 5 times more. This thing was an absolute giant among giants. And weirdly enough, Western science only discovered it recently, in 1741, when shipwrecked explorers in the Bering Sea stumbled across these enormous gentle sea cows. Here's the problem. They were too buoyant to fully sink. Part of their body was always sticking out of the water. And since they fed in shallow kelp forests right along the shoreline, they were ridiculously easy to hunt. So naturally, they became the next victim of nature's deadliest invention, the pointy stick. To make things worse, they were extremely social animals. When one got attacked, the others would rush in to help, even ramming boats in defense. Unfortunately, that just made them even easier targets. Sorry if that one hurt. But on the bright side, we were mostly just finishing the job. By the time we found them, there were probably only a few thousand left, tucked away in the far edges of their range. And just 27 years after being discovered, they were completely gone. Now let's talk about the last land-dwelling crocodile our ancestors also ate. When the dinosaurs went extinct, mammals didn't immediately take over. Instead, giant terrestrial crocodiles ruled the land for a while. Eventually, most of them disappeared until just one remained on the island of New Caledonia. But unlike the others, this island didn't turn it into a giant. Instead, it stayed relatively small, growing to only about 6 feet long. That's an example of something called island dwarfism. Quick side note, that same phenomenon is likely where the myth of the Cyclops came from, based on the skulls of dwarf mammoths found on the island of Crete. Anyway, back to the crocodile. This species was called Mecasuchus inexpectatus, literally named that because no one expected to find a land-dwelling crocodile on a random island when they were thought to be long extinct. And that wasn't the only weird thing about it. While we usually think of crocodiles as strict carnivores, this one was probably omnivorous. But once humans arrived on the island around 3,000 years ago, crocodile bones suddenly started showing up in ancient trash pits. We're not completely sure if we were actively eating them, or if these crocs were just the prehistoric equivalent of raccoons digging through our garbage. Honestly, it might have been both. Now it's time to meet the biggest marsupial to ever walk the earth. Diprotodon? It was a giant wombat, almost 10 feet long, over 6 feet tall at the shoulder, and weighing up to around 7,500 pounds. They likely lived in small groups made up of a few smaller females and one absolute unit of a dominant male. They probably communicated using deep, low grunts produced by their massive nasal cavities. That would have been useful in an environment packed with predators, because even back then, humans weren't close to the scariest thing around. Australia had about 10,000 other ways to kill you. One of them was the marsupial lion, but the worst was probably Megalania, a gigantic venomous monitor lizard that grew over 20 feet long. So if you were a Diprotodon, humans were just another threat on a very long list. Still a problem, but not the biggest one. We showed up somewhere between 65,000 and 50,000 years ago, and not long after that, Diprotodon disappeared. How much of that was directly our fault is still debated, but at Barati Rock Shelter in South Australia, archaeologists found Diprotodon bones buried alongside human tools. That wouldn't be too strange, except the shelter is halfway up a mountain, which means someone probably dragged it up there. Still, one meal alone wouldn't wipe out an entire species. Around the same time, the environment was falling apart too. About 45,000 years ago, Australia began to dry out, and no place shows that better than Lake Calabana. This is what it used to look like. Today, it's barely even a lake. But thousands of years ago, it was a thriving watering hole, one that Diprotodon depended on. As the water slowly vanished, they had to travel farther and farther, just to reach what little remained. That's why the lakebed is covered in bones, a massive graveyard of Diprotodons that couldn't make it in time. And to be honest, this probably made it much easier for us to find food. Now here's an interesting question. Which animal on this list did you not expect people to eat? Write your answer in the comments.